Good luck spelling the title of this episode. Welcome to Not Just Any Book Club, the episode about Friedrich Nietzsche.
Oh
Friedrich
boy.
Nietzsche.
I was about to make a joke about good luck pronouncing it because as someone who learned some German in college, it bothers me when people pronounce it very wrong.
Like I just did.
Yeah, it's Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche. And yeah, this is Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche's his seminal work, I guess, is like the work he's most famous for. He has a later work that is more that he never finished that was supposed to be his magnum opus, but I think this and Thus Spoke Zarathustra have come to be his kind of what he's most known for, his magnum opus, the things that people point to first when you talk about Friedrich Nietzsche. Even though he has many works and many of them are good. My name is Pierce.
And my name is Justin. And as you can kind of tell, Pierce is a lot of it really, completely more well-read than I am in terms of philosophy. So I'm about to get schooled on this podcast. I'm about to get humiliated.
Well, I should also say I am. What is that thing called? You know that phenomenon where like you're a beginner and like you think, oh, I'm so competent at this, like I'm learning the Dunning-Kruger effect, and then you get to like an intermediate level and your confidence like comes way down. You're like, oh, yeah, I don't know anything, because you see how much you actually don't know once you get to an intermediate level. That's kind of where I'm at with philosophy, to be honest. I've started to come into the like low intermediate level, and I'm like, man, there's so much I don't know. It's kind of insane. But that does mean that I'm a ways into my journey with philosophy in general. Maybe I'll make some videos on that on our YouTube channel. We'll see. Perhaps. But Nietzsche was a figure that I was always kind of interested in, because I was trying to read it mostly in order. Nietzsche was a figure I was always kind of interested in jumping forward to see what all the fuss was about, because he is pretty insanely popular as figures in philosophy go. Especially like, you kind of get like Plato and Aristotle or the beginning. Camus is very modern, kind of has a modern sensibility to him. So you kind of get like why he's so popular. There's some other ones that I could probably name. Like, you get why a lot of these figures are super, super popular. But you don't quite, I don't think I quite got it with Nietzsche before I'd read him. And it was interesting because you can see kind of from the outside that there are all these different people who like him, who completely disagree on many things. Honestly, I've seen people on the extremes of both ends of the political spectrum claim to love Nietzsche. And that's part of why he kind of gets a bad name, which we'll get into. But yeah, he's a really interesting figure, and I really wanted to see what kind of the fuss was all about. So we talked about doing another philosophy month, and I jumped ahead. I read 5 of his works one time through, and then skimmed them a second time just to like kind of hopefully solidify some things. I watched some secondary sources and stuff to like help, because I skipped so much to get to it and I was trying to dive in so heavily. And so I want to preface this discussion with like, if I jump around to something or talk about Nietzsche generally, I'm concerned that I won't have as good recall for this work in particular during this discussion, just because I ran through everything for my first time through with Nietzsche. But but I'm ready to discuss him generally for sure, and we'll talk about the specifics as much as we can from Beyond Good and Evil.
Yeah. And you're about to see the opposite end of the spectrum, because then there's me. There's a reason why I didn't really upload the old philosophy episode, because that was bad on my part.
I mean, I also didn't like how I did it either, because we just started going through it chapter by chapter, and that it wasn't very good. So,
but I was really bad. Yeah. I mean, if you're curious about that, check out the Spotify or whatever. Just not on YouTube, because that has been hidden.
Yeah. I didn't. It was our first time doing something like that. I was still early on reading philosophy. We weren't ready to do an episode like that. So hopefully this one will be better.
Not much improved. Yeah.
Hopefully this one will be better. All right. So I mean, Nietzsche. Again, I kind of touched on him for a second. He is an interesting figure. I keep going to the word confounding when I talk about him with other people, because he is a figure that, like I said, people from all over the political spectrum like for different reasons, who kind of is associated with nihilism, but also is kind of given. Some people give some of his aphorisms the phrase like life affirming. They call it life affirming philosophy. So that doesn't completely match up. He's kind of a hammer of sorts for old types of morality, which we'll talk about. But he doesn't really give a whole lot of prescriptions either, which was something that was confusing when I was reading him. It's hard to get a sense of what Nietzsche wants going forward. There are some things that I could say that I think he would want, but like that he would think would be good for society. But he works, even though he's pushing for a rebuilding of morality. I think he spends a lot more time as the hammer than the like rebuilder. If you get my meaning. So he's kind of a confounding figure. People try to make him say what they want him to say, rather than taking him at what he's actually saying at his face value, which is kind of how you get people from all over the political spectrum who like him. Something that he was scared of. But to go over his kind of history a little bit, he is a German philosopher. German philosophers are often complicated and confusing, but he writes pretty beautifully for a German, pretty wonderfully. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is again his other most famous book, is basically like all of his philosophy down into a very poetic kind of prose, like purpley language, which is really interesting to read if you know his philosophy already. So he writes quite beautifully, and is quite a joy to read compared to other philosophy, in my opinion. He is not really huge during his life. He works at a university. He gets his work published. A lot of it he has to publish himself and pay for. But he's not really famous during his life. And then he goes crazy. I believe it's from sickness. In his older years, he starts to go a little insane. I'm not. I did some reading about it. I couldn't find exactly what it was about.
Was he like writing philosophy while he was sick, or?
Well, so he actually was kind of a sickly person throughout his entire life. He, to my understanding, he, especially in his like the later half of his writings, he would like have times when he was very healthy and he would write a whole bunch all at once, and then he would have times where he was sick, and he would have to take breaks for long periods of time. Yeah, I don't know. Anyways, he gets sick in his old age. He goes a little crazy. His sister comes home to take care of him. She is a huge anti-Semite, a huge nationalist. She ends up being a huge supporter of the Nazi party, and she shapes his words and his image because she kind of controls his writing as she was his caretaker in his last few years. She shapes his words and his image to be kind of like this very pro-Nazi type philosophy. Mm-hmm. But and this is kind of his image through the 1930s, through Nazi Germany, that he's this very like essentially a proto-Nazi, that he is like pro-nationalism, pro the strong overtaking the weak, and he, the idea is that he kind of is one of those figures that helps lead to the development of Nazism. But after the war, after World War II, there's kind of a shift in interpretations of him, kind of spurned on by Charles Kaufman, whose biography of Nietzsche I want to read in greater detail. I kind of rushed through it to finish it for this podcast, but spurned on by Charles Kaufman, who kind of says, no, Nietzsche is not actually this proto-Nazi. We've been not we've been, but the Nazis misinterpreted him. They kind of took what they wanted and not kind of not his work as a whole. And I think certain people still do that to this day. It's very easy to do with him because of his style. Justin, what stood out to? Can you explain his style? Can you talk about? I think this would be something tone? That you could discuss. His style, the way that he writes philosophy.
He does write pretty eloquently, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
But at least just my general impression, his tone seems to be pretty self-aggrandizing, pretty coggy. He just talks about I don't know if it's like before masculinity was really the concept that it is today, but he writes a lot about that. I mean, I'm guessing this is philosophy where he has to really have to be confident, you have to talk about the truth, but some of it does go a bit too far. He also talks about going against the grain on religion. I don't know if you mentioned anything about that or alluded to him being not a big fan of Christianity.
We'll talk a lot about his opinions on Christianity soon, I think.
Yeah, but I don't get the allegations about him being an anti-Semite, because there is one, I forgot what passage it is, where he talks about the Jews. They're pretty awesome, which I'm like, that was something I didn't expect.
Yeah, he actually has a few different passages throughout his books where he says anti-Semitism is bad, actually. Guys.
Just like an anti-Semite.
Yeah. Charles Kaufman, I read a passage from him. He actually claims that Nietzsche was pro-race mixing because of something that he says about... You also have to think in the 1800s, they're thinking of race as like the Germans are a race and the Poles are a race and so on. And he said he talks about something that Nietzsche wrote where he said that he says something about the Poles and the Germans mixing and the Slavs being particularly strong, and that God, I'd have to go find it. But essentially, some of the really strong parts of Germanness comes from their mixing with the Poles. Is something that I believe Kaufman points out. So he gets this rap again. Kaufman kind of shifts how we think about Nietzsche. Or how some of us think about Nietzsche. Kaufman kind of shifts that to where we're at today. But the thing that I was more alluding to when I talked about how easy it is to kind of take his words out of context is the aphorism. He's kind of one of the most famous users of books written purely in aphorisms, which are short, shorter
phrases,
phrases, sentences, paragraphs, a few pages here or there, maybe, just short sections where he makes kind of a concise argument or claim or a musing of sorts, depending on what it is, and then moves on. He's very digestible in that way. It's probably why I was able to go through so much of his work so quickly.
Yeah. And I think that's why you recommended it to me.
Yeah. That's part of why I also said that this might be good for an episode, because you'd be able to kind of digest the aphorisms one at a time.
Yeah.
But it does make it very easy to take him out of context, even in your own mind. There are times when I see him say something and I'm like, that's a little weird, and then I'll think about it and I'll be like, well, the way that I took that doesn't really make sense in the context of like other things that I've read that Nietzsche has said. And so I don't know. Again, this is kind of why he's such a confounding figure. He's he feels like he contradicts himself in places. And maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. But
yeah. My general impressions of just Nietzsche, though, or did I pronounce his name right? Don't.
Nietzsche.
We'll get. I mean, okay. Don't make fun of a person for pronouncing things incorrectly, because that means they read it first off. But my general impressions about him is that I mean, it is kind of easy to see why a lot of his quotes and philosophies have just been kind of taken out of context. One, because they're digestible. Two, they do address some very extreme concepts, like masculinity and pride and patriotism, and even anti-Christianity. Is that something, or anti-religion in general?
Yeah, well, he's not anti-spirituality completely. It doesn't seem like, but he's definitely anti, like Christian morals specifically.
Ooh. Yeah,
like the way Christianity has kind of set itself up, in particular, is something he's against.
Yeah, and would you say that, like, because he really did go into a lot of detail about his life and his biography, do you think that's essential to really understanding Nietzsche, his entire philosophy?
What, his background?
Yeah, and his life, really.
I think that his background, especially the stuff about his sister kind of taking charge and shaping thought about him, is important. Because something that I read is that certain translations you might get still have the way, like it's still translated from the way that she organized his thought, of certain works specifically of his. So, when you're reading some of this stuff, you have to kind of keep in mind who was, putting some of these books together. Not these earlier ones. Beyond Good and Evil, he saw published himself. But especially some of his later stuff, I think it's vitally important to know that she, affected the way that those were organized and talked about.
Huh.
And then I also think it's for philosophers in particular, I think it's good to know at least a little bit about them, because you are reading someone's thoughts, basically, in their as pure form as I think you can get them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're trying to get across usually very conceptual ideas, and so I think kind of knowing about them kind of helps with that in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. And Nietzsche in particular is, I think, just a very interesting figure.
Yeah. I feel like if you have a good edition, like the Penguins Classics, I think they'll recontextualize it in like an introduction, which I didn't read. I should have read. I usually skip those, and probably should have read for this one. Again, going into this unprepared, going in as the layman that just decided to read Beyond Good and Evil on a whim.
Well, so there's some things that I'd like to talk about Nietzsche generally that I don't think you would have read much about.
Great.
But I think before I do any of that, we should do some content from the book that we are basing the episode off of.
Okay. Really, the only book I read, and one of the 5 that you read. So
yeah. So Beyond Good and Evil. Okay. The title says it all, right? Yeah. Nietzsche makes kind of the claim here that we have to go beyond our traditional ideas of good and evil, that those traditional moralities. Obviously, I can go into some detail about that, but I would want to pose the question to you first. Just what stood out to you about his critiques of traditional morality, traditional Christian morality, traditional philosophy? Just anything that stood out from you from really the first few parts of the book.
I'm looking through my notes right now. There were a couple passages, like Proverb 11, where I just circled it, put a giant question mark. So there, that's kind of the general vibe. What is it? Trying to see. Passage 12 was the one, I think the first one where he really talks about how soul is not real, and such conceptions as mortal soul and soul as multiplicity of the subject and soul as social structure of the drives and emotions want henceforth to possess civic rights in science. He calls it a superstition. He doesn't really believe in soul idea. He calls it just like a luxuriance, just mistrust. Basically, he especially spirituality, he kind of finds it a bit phony.
Yeah, the soul
Wrong.
is a concept in philosophy reaches pretty far back. So
yeah,
to break with that already is to break with a very like traditional idea in philosophy and obviously also religion. But
yeah, I remember in the first section at least he really rails against Plato as well. And see, I did read Plato, but did I understand a word of Plato? Not really. So I really don't have any base to criticize or really understand where his criticisms are coming from. But it's a lot.
He expands. He has kind of a thing about Plato and Socrates, as kind of the first. He goes into detail in his first book, which I can't recommend it, to be honest with you. The Birth of Tragedy. To be honest, I cannot recommend The Birth of Tragedy, if I'm being honest.
Boring or just like
it's good. It has some interesting moments, but it's probably the most of a slog of any of his books. There are some really interesting points that he makes in it that I really enjoy about art and creating and art as interpretation and creativity as kind of life-giving in a way that he brings those ideas forward into his other works though. And what's left there is stuff that I didn't quite enjoy as much, very like literary analysis, comparing different interpretations of life through art to like Greek gods, the Apollonian and the Dionysian arts, basically. It's interesting, and if you're gonna try and complete Nietzsche or read most of him, then I recommend it. But if you're not going to, then I honestly can't recommend it. But
I am nodding my head so hard right now.
Neither here nor there. Anyway, the point is, in that book, he kind of goes into in one section of it. He talks about Plato and Socrates quite a bit in his other works as well, but he kind of goes into Socrates as kind of an extension, as like a new kind of interpretation of the world, as very optimistic. Like there is something objective that you can find out. And he doesn't say it in as many words, but it kind of lends itself to this later idea that we're going to see in here, that I was going to mention when you were done, but I think I'll just go ahead and mention it now.
Go for it.
The idea that there isn't really an objective truth, that everything is kind of based off your perception, and even philosophies that claim to be based on objective truth are based on some of the preconceived notions of that philosopher. And so, I don't think that it's exactly one-to-one, the complaint about Socrates then and then into him talking about Plato now. But I think you can kind of see generally through his work these criticisms of philosophy through their like founder in the Western canon, founders in Plato and Socrates. But yeah. Was there anything else that stood out to you?
I really should have kept on looking. 31, he talks about how the youth are just kind of lost and bad. I put in my notes, youth bad. I don't think I don't think that's, very some of these notes were kind of shorthand because you did really recommend to me to really annotate the hell out of it, and I did for the first half the book at least, and then I kind of got a little bit sidetracked, but I'm laughing at my own notes. I think for 25, I think he was saying outcast equal based suffer from enlightenment. So I'm guessing that's the same going. Don't be afraid to break away from the masses.
Yeah. So I mean, this whole section is about generally some aphorisms I feel like don't completely match with the chapter they're a part of. Sometimes he goes off on tangents for an aphorism here and there.
You're telling me.
But generally, this whole section is kind of about what he thinks. Which one were you pointing to? 2025, you said?
25, the one real on page 55.
It's right at the beginning of it. Yeah. This whole chapter generally is kind of about what he thinks that a new philosopher should be like. That they should be free-spirited and kind of break away from these traditional ideas that he critiqued in the last part. I'm looking at my notes now.
Your notes are probably better than mine. He also talks about just like pride as well a lot too. So there's that. I think somewhere in aphorism 22.
Yeah. The new philosopher, the free spirit, should kind of break from the traditional ideas of their time. That philosophers kind of in their very nature should be going against whatever the like dominant idea of their time is, or something of that sort, that they should be kind of pushing back against the like tide of whatever the masses believe and trying to mark new ground, essentially. And that's what he's looking to do, is he's looking to break away from these traditional moralities and make way for people to he often goes with like a kind of an explorer, like an ocean explorer metaphor, where you set sail on the sea for new lands, and he kind of views that as what like the new philosopher and the new free spirit should be. kind of set forth into a new morality of some kind. And again, with the like I said, Nietzsche doesn't really give too many prescriptions. I don't feel like he really defines what a new morality would look like. Yeah. He doesn't even really try to. He says what he thinks is good about how the world used to work before Christian morality and democratic morality kind of made its way into society. But I don't think that that's necessarily a complete prescriptive. We'll talk about those later. I don't think that that's necessarily completely prescriptive either. So it's kind of, again, like you could kind of take him in a lot of different directions because he's just kind of getting you to think about it. He's kind of laying the groundwork. He's trying to make arguments that break down the old moralities,
like Christianity,
and he's not really completely saying what should be built in their place, but he is saying that someone should build something in their place. And maybe, I don't know, maybe he's saying that our perspectives are so varied that it's kind of impossible to have this kind of universal objective morality. And so that's why he kind of points to the strong in the last chapter. I don't know. Again, he's not super prescriptive. He gets you. He's great at getting you to think about some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, he is good at trying to make me think to really understand what he's even saying. That's one way to put it.
Okay, well, so we kind of covered, I would say, the first two chapters for the most part, first two parts. Just kind of what they're generally about. He also, in that first part, he critiques a bunch of philosophers, some specifically by name.
Voltaire, but one of them, I think.
Yeah, Voltaire, Kant by name, a few others. But really, especially, I can't find the aphorism now. I want to say I think it's in this book. But really, he's critiquing. He critiques Kant's like moral systems in particular. At some point, I believe in this part, and really, he's kind of critiquing the dogma of some of these people, that they have all these preconceived notions. They think that they're building up these objective moral systems, but actually, they're not questioning the very root of those beliefs and of those systems that they're creating or laying out. And that's kind of what he has a problem with, I think. It seems to me. He goes after the whole, like, I think therefore I am phrase, where I think that's aphorism 17.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. 16, I think.
16? It's one of them where he basically says something along the lines of, like, you have to make a whole bunch of assumptions to even get to I think therefore I am. Like, you have to assume that I is a thing that exists to think in the first place, or that think is an action that can be done, or that thinking is even like did you find the aphorism?
It is actually 17. You're right. 16 was just talking about I think. Like, what is it? There are still harmless self-observers who believe immediate certainties exist. For example, I think, or I will. Oh no, 16 is talking about nothing is certain. It does talk about the fact that you can't really use I for certain. But 17 is talking about I is definitely not certain. I is the condition of predicate think. It thinks, but that is this. It is precisely that famous old I, is, to put mildly. A lot of other sentences.
Yeah. Only an assumption and assertion, above all, not an immediate certainty.
Yeah.
It already contains an interpretation of the event. It does not belong to the event itself. Yeah. I think there's another section I'm thinking of where he also does something similar. But yeah, he basically a part of the problem that he's laying out with some of these traditional moralities, the philosophers, is that they have all these preconceived notions, but they claim to be very objective, right? They claim to be going after the root of objective truth, of this objective moral reality, and Nietzsche is saying you're not questioning even the very root of that. And when you get down to the root, you can see that perspective matters. Like it's perspective is where a lot of morals come from. What you and I might consider evil, which he gets into later, I believe, what you and I might consider evil, an evil person, evil, quotation marks, an evil person does evil things and doesn't feel bad about them. Whereas when we talk about objective morality, we're talking about, no rational human should be able to do these things. But some of the things that we would consider evil or immoral aren't necessarily irrational. So yeah. So his problem again is with kind of these preconceptions of the philosophers. Their morals are the basis for them isn't strong enough. Were you able to catch his specific problems with Christianity?
That's a good question. If I really kept track of that. Well, I just turned to a random one. I think it's 61. Well, yeah, I think I put in my notes that he says that religion ruins society for most. Perhaps, and quote, perhaps nothing in Christianity and Buddhism is so venerable as their art of teaching even the lowliest to set themselves through piety in an apparently higher order of things, and thus to preserve their contentment with the real order within which they live hard enough lives and necessarily have to. So I'm assuming that's just him saying religion, to be like Marx, is the opiate of the masses and kind of makes them content, not wanting more in this earthly life.
Basically, we haven't talked that. Yeah, yeah. You're at the very least on the right track there. He basically thinks that we haven't talked that much about it because he doesn't mention it by name in this book. But I mean, everybody knows Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, right? Which is, it's actually technically the Overman. There's a translation. It does also mean super in German, but the translation, it relies on the double meaning of the word Uber. It doesn't translate well. Anyways, the better translation is the Overman. I believe that's why, if I'm not mistaken. I might be mistaken on that. But basically, Nietzsche kind of believes that there's a higher status, a higher form that humanity in humans can reach. And one of the few prescriptions he does seem to make is that we should order society in a way that those who are able, who have the ability to reach that higher form, have all of the opportunity to do so. He appears at times willing to sacrifice the needs of the many for those few to reach those heights. It appears at times. I'm not sure. I don't think he ever comes right out and says that, but it certainly appears that way at times, I think. But I bring that up in particular because I think that's kind of at the heart of his problem with Christian morality, that it praises the meek and the weak and the the sinful, and allows people to be content in their meekness, and so they'll never reach for those heights. That people who are enamored with Christianity and Christian morality will forever be forever stay kind of in that station. I think the other thing with it, though, which I got a little bit better once I had read the genealogy on morals, or genealogy of morals, is that Nietzsche's real problem with a lot of these herd moralities, as he calls them, is that it kind of breeds resentment, or not that it breeds resentment, that he feels, or he thinks that a lot of these moralities come from resentment in particular, that they are kind of formed from some kind of resentment, that the weak flock to some kind of morality where the weak and the many can outweigh the needs and the wants and the desires of the strong few, because they resent them for being strong. And this is where I think you can kind of take him out of context a little bit and kind of get him to say what you want him to say, because you can then go on to say, you could use him as the Nazis would, and use his concept of the will to power as a will to physically and politically overpower everyone around you, when really that concept is about becoming kind of the Übermensch, the overman, being the best version of a human that you can possibly be. And so, it gets a little dicey. And again, another reason why I think he's so confounding as a figure.
So yeah. Was him writing that kind of, I guess, kind of aspirational? Because you say that he was a sickly figure in the midst of writing a lot of philosophy. I don't know if he was like that his entire life. So would that have been achievable if he was railing against Christianity, and he's talking about he must reach the heights of our personal abilities?
I don't think he viewed himself as a person who was going to reach those heights. I think at most he viewed himself as someone who was trying to lay the groundwork for other people to reach those heights. I don't know if he thought that the Übermensch was right around the corner. I think he thought that maybe, I don't know, maybe there's something in one of his other works that says that he thought it was right around the corner if Christianity came down ultimately very quickly. But it doesn't. When he talks about the free spirit and the free thinkers of his time, he doesn't seem to think that the change is coming incredibly soon. But I think that he does see the writing on the wall for traditional morality. And he was pretty ahead of his time in that way. Like the whole God is dead and we have killed him thing. Like, I would say that's more true today than it was in the late 1800s. Because the idea behind that is that God is dead. People are less religious, and so we've kind of killed God, and we're left with the corpse of these traditional morals with no kind of backing to them anymore. And And I'd say that you could kind of see that more today than you could have seen it. It's easier to see today than it would have been back then, because you see a lot of people taking on spiritual spiritualities that I think Nietzsche might find ridiculous, that have no real like kind of moral backing or ethical backing or anything like that. They just are. And you see people kind of taking things on, whereas they would have being passionate about things that they might not have been as passionate about back in the day, that they are kind of taking on. It's kind of a conservative criticism of modernity, that like people are so passionate about politics that it's kind of a new religion for some people. And again, that's kind of the thing. Like people all over the political spectrum like this guy, because I think he honestly he says a bunch of things that I think are so true. I think he also says some things that are like certifiable crazy, that are like based on these other very true, very ahead of their time things that he said. I recommend anyone who's heard of him and is intrigued, or heard of him and thinks like, oh, that's a red flag whenever someone else says they like Nietzsche, that you should read him, because he is not what you think he is. No matter what you think of him, I don't think he's going to end up being what you think he is. I
came into completely blind, and I'm like, obviously, I think with philosophy in general, if you read a book from way back when, it's going to have some problematic stuff because our values evolve over time. But I mean, overall, there are things that if you mine through it, there are some good chunks where it's like, I agree. I didn't really give it that perspective before, so there's a little bit of that too.
Yeah, that's the thing with him, is there's aphorisms that I'm like, that is so true, and I never would have thought of it like that. Like that is, he's putting words to a thing that I know is true, but I just wouldn't have been able to explain it like that. My mind goes to his concept of eternal recurrence. Not that I think eternal recurrence is real necessarily, but that he uses it as kind of a life-affirming thing. That in the Gay Science, which is obviously not the book we're talking about today, but in the Gay Science, there's an aphorism, which if you're just starting out with Nietzsche, I actually would recommend that one to anyone out there. Yeah. I recommend it to you too, Justin, but it'll just be your second book instead of your first. But in the Gay Science, he speaks about, there's an aphorism where he essentially says, if a demon came to you and told you that you were cursed to relive your life exactly how it's been, down to the second, down to the moment, for eternity, over and over again, would you get down on your knees and curse the devil and weep and be upset that this has happened to you, or would it make you happy? Would it fill you with joy? Have you done enough in your life? Are you doing things in your life that you would do it all over again and over again forever? I don't know. Just as a way, eternal recurrence, I'm not bought into the like spiritual side of it, where life though everything repeats the way it has forever and ever and ever for eternity. Time is a circle. I don't know if I'm bought into all that, but I am bought into it as an idea to think about your life. Would you be willing to do this all over again, like from the beginning, and experience the same highs and the same lows? And would you come out of it feeling happy every single time. And I think to think about life like that is, it is motivating in one sense, and also life affirming in another sense, and also really hopeful, or I guess joyful, if we're talking about the other translation for that book, The Joyful Science.
Okay.
Joyful in a sense, to think about life like that. Anyways, yeah, the life affirming philosophy in the joyous, or the gay science, however you translate that word. The life affirming philosophy in that book, I think, is excellent when it does come up. So I do recommend it. But the point is that I think Nietzsche gets really close to truth, closer than, so close on so many different topics. I don't know if he gets there completely on every single one. In fact, I think he misses pretty severely on a few. But he gets so close to truth in so many of these aphorisms that it's really, like, quite incredible to read, I think.
That is interesting. I mean, I was just looking at the concept of eternal return, because that is pretty interesting. Pretty interesting concept.
Yeah. He talks about it a few different ways. There's a section in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that's basically about, like, the different periods of people's lives, and man, it's so memorable, and I can't remember it right now. But anyways, yeah. So I think I kind of wanted to I kind of missed it, because I when I touched on eternal recurrence and life affirmation with Nietzsche, I wanted to touch on nihilism specifically, because Nietzsche kind of gets lumped in as, like, kind of a figurehead of nihilism, almost, it feels like at times. That's what I've heard about him before I read him, was that he was a nihilist of sorts. I don't think he's a nihilist, like, pretty much at all. I think that, or maybe he is, but I don't think his philosophy in particular lends itself particularly well to nihilism. Obviously, he's very life affirming. I think you technically could be that and be a nihilist, but all of his, I think you could read Nietzsche and come out of it feeling very bad about the state of society and the way things are, because he spends so much time tearing down the traditions and making you think hard and long about the things that you've grown up believing. But I think he does it in service of building back something new. And so I don't think he's particularly nihilist, as he kind of gets the rap for by laymen and people who have read about him but not read him himself.
Yeah, not gonna lie, that's the expectations I came into reading Beyond Good and Evil. But I wouldn't say that he's much of an nihilist, or even of an absurdist either, where you kind of just find joy in the fact that, like, life has no meaning.
No, I think that he finds meaning particularly in kind of a few things, maybe. He seems to find some meaning in the interpretation of suffering, which is why he writes so much about art in some of his other works. He seems to find a lot of meaning in human suffering itself. He thinks it makes us better He thinks it creates us and it turns us into better humans. He thinks people who suffer more generally are better than people who have suffered less.
Yeah. Aphorism 161: Poets behave impudently towards their experiences. They exploit them. So it's one of those real short sentences that he made.
Yeah. Right. But he what was I saying?
I think I threw you completely off.
You did.
Art, creating art from suffering.
Yeah. So he seems to find meaning in suffering in particular. He thinks it makes us stronger, it makes us better. So, maybe he's like, I guess it's possible he's a specific type of nihilist and that he doesn't believe there's like an objective meaning, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. When I hear someone's a nihilist, like there's kind of a certain expectation I go into it with. But I don't know. I don't find Nietzsche to be particularly nihilist based on my own preconceived notions about what nihilism is and is not. Yeah. I don't know.
I don't know if I have a take on that either. I mean, I would just say for certain, but look, I am not too well versed in philosophy for me to say that. But
right. Well, you referenced absurdism, like that's a type of nihilism. I don't think he's even as nihilist as Camus. And Camus is kind of one to it's finding meaning in the absurdity of life. I guess you could say that if you were to call him a nihilist, he would be closer to that than another type. But I don't think that he's really. You're right. I don't think he's absurdist either. I don't know. He's not very. There's like a pessimist movement in Europe that he's not very fond of. Which is a nihilist movement in Europe that he's not very fond of. So there's that in particular.
He does lament that a lot, like the state of Germany, at least.
Oh,
I don't know if that was alluding to the pessimistic movement.
He is a German which I haven't really gotten that much into it because it's kind of. I mean, it's obviously in the scope of the book because he talks about it, but it's not really like it doesn't. I think it adds a ton to the overall meaning, but I think it is interesting to read him knowing a little bit about German history because he is clearly someone who loves Germanness in some sense, but also kind of laments what it is in another sense. He like what's that?
In a way, he's kind of like the boomers of today.
Yeah, I don't know. He's kind of an interesting figure as someone who I believe was around when Germany was formed as a country, and he says that was a terrible mistake. So he's kind of an interesting figure because he's a primary source. Technically, he was there, or he was alive at the time. Not there, but he was there. He was alive when it happened. So he's got some really interesting takes. If you are learning German history or reading German figures, read what Nietzsche had to say about German culture and history, because he's definitely. We're not going to go too much into it because it would just be me talking about it for the next 15 to 20 minutes.
It should be a bonus episode or something. Who knows?
But if you're learning German history, like please go read what Nietzsche has to say about it because it is interesting. But anything else you wanted to talk about? Anything that stuck out to you?
His views of women. That's a big one.
We can talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that might be an interesting part of his legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because like again, in some areas where he's forward, him being an anti-Semite, which is pretty based. But then he has I had this quote, one of the short aphorisms, I think. And I even put an angry face next to it if I can find it. Where is it? Oh, and one of them, 139, in revenge and in love, woman is more barbarous than man. I don't think that's anti-woman, but like that's something. Oh, 131. The sexes deceive themselves about one another. The reason being that fundamentally they love and honor only themselves for their own ideal to express it more pleasantly. Thus, man wants woman to be peaceful, but woman is essentially unpeaceful, like the cat. However, well, she may have trained herself to present an appearance of peace. Hey, man, not cool.
That one is actually not at all. I think that's actually a pretty good aphorism from him about the relationship between men and women, and it's kind of self-deflating in a way of the other things that he says about women in other places, because he's saying that men and women deceive themselves about one another, that men have an expectation of women that is different from the way that they are. And you know, whatever he's saying now, to be honest, could be completely off base based on his own interpretation of the situation, because obviously he is a man. Listen, if you go on the like Nietzschean corners of the internet, you'll see people defending all of the things that he says about women. I will not do that. But what I will say is that sometimes there is some like, for instance, for a bad thing, when a woman has scholarly inclinations, there's usually something wrong with her sexuality. Unfruitfulness itself disposes one to a certain masculinity of taste. Yeah, that I feel like you could extend out to kind of a more modern, like, you know, like, not to get political, but JD Vance calling all of the like women in DC cat ladies or whatever, like that, you could essentially extend it out that way, if you kind of interpret it and then interpolate it a little bit. But anyways, you know, that as for a bad thing that he says, but some of the things he says are quite understanding, I think, of what women go through. Like, you know, what you read, where he talks about how men and women misunderstand each other.
Yeah.
He talks about
frantically just like look for a woman in like the really short aphorism. So that wasn't accurate. 115 was probably the one that I really wanted to go to, but as you're saying,
there are, where neither love nor hate is in the game, a woman is a mediocre player. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there are also aphorisms where he's very understanding. Like, there's one where he writes about, I want to say this one's in the Joyous or the Gay Science, again. He says basically that a woman is, he kind of laments the expectations that are put onto women, that when they're young, they're taught to be chaste, and that their chastity means everything. And that they are not sexual beings whatsoever, and that they are meant to kind of hide themselves away from the eye of young men until they're married. And then when they're married, they are expected to be sexual beings for their now husband. They're expected to change completely what the expectations were on them of their, you know, of their class as young women, into now the complete opposite for their husbands. And he kind of laments this fact, kind of showing a real understanding through about what women might be going through in that kind of transition from young chaste woman to married woman. And there's instances of him being not a complete sexist freak. Like, he was one of very few people at his university to vote for women being incorporated into the university. I believe that vote lost, but he voted in favor of it. And so, you can comb through and you can see him being very weird about women in some cases, and again, very confounding figure, and being very understanding of women's plight in other cases. He's a very confusing guy in some of the things that he believes, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I think that's what most people, especially going way back, they're an amalgamation of modern views and then some not so good views.
Yeah, but them being so clearly laid out like this is not
that
a
is true.
common occurrence. Especially with how contradictory you can see him being in one book because of the aphorisms. In one aphorism he seems very understanding of women's plight, and in the next he's saying something you could frame very easily as sexist. So yeah, it's because of the aphorism, his style, those kind of opposing, what we would view now as opposing viewpoints, come across very, very easily.
You got that right. Do you have? Oh, well, I don't know if we're wrapping things up, but since we're kind of on the Marxisms and interludes chapter, do you have a particular favorite one out of those? Any short sentences? 146 cheating. Just saying.
146 is cheating. Oh, that super famous one.
Yeah.
He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster, and when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Yeah, that's quite famous.
Classic.
I starred actually a bunch of these. There were a bunch of these that I liked.
Do you have any particular one that you would like just to relay? As in, like, basically, if you wanted to advertise this book to the layman like me, and we're like, all right, this book has this one sentence. You got to read it.
Speaking of men and women, here's one that I starred. The same emotions in man and women, however, different in tempo. Therefore, man and women never cease to misunderstand one another. 85. Sorry, I was just skipping through all of the ones that I starred. Again, there are a bunch that I starred. So 97, I'm gonna read probably like 2 or 3. Okay. 97 is one that I think particularly kind of gives a really good insight into Nietzsche's whole philosophy in just a very short set line, basically. What a great man! I always see only the actor of his own ideal. So that kind of perspectivist, there is no like objective ideal for kind of this guy to follow. A great man is following his own ideal. He's staking his claim on what he thinks is good or right, and he's following that. That's kind of what I wanted to wrap up with in a second, but we'll get to it. That which an age feels to be evil is usually an untimely after echo of that which was formerly felt to be good. The atavism of an older ideal, something that I think is true, but not necessarily bad. Progress happens. We move on. Something that conservatives in particular would like, especially the further right ones. There was something else. There's one that I really liked that I...
Well, in the meantime, I'll read my one favorite one.
Yeah, go ahead.
156. Madness is something rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, people, ages, it is the rule. So that kind of reminds me. I guess the people that wrote Men in Black was just, kind of took that quote and made it even simpler. A person is smart, but people are dumb. That is good quote. Good quote right there. Quality.
Mature manhood, that means to have rediscovered the seriousness one had as a child at play, which is kind of an idea he brings up a few different times, where he talks about kind of we have to find the jester as well as the sage in our joy for learning. He talks at length about how we can't just be serious about everything. Like there should be a joy for good things. as well as a seriousness about them to encounter them seriously. We also need to, act joyously and live joyously. God, there was one that I starred that I now cannot find, and that was the last one.
That's what you get for starring all of them, apparently.
I didn't star all of them. I starred like one per page.
Yeah, as I'm just like scrolling past these, I'm like, wow, that's base, and some of them are just like, you can tone down the misogyny just a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, as a collective, you could probably just like look at these. These go well in an Instagram reel, all right? If you guys want to look smart, take a picture of these and be like, this is going on my Instagram page if you want to be pseudo-scientific or pseudo-smart.
Don't do that. I mean, yeah, post them if you want, but you should actually read it as well.
Flex.
I think you'll get something from it, and then you can flex on top of that.
Yeah.
I cannot find it now for whatever reason. Now I'm
it could be. Is it like in a different book or?
No, because I saw it. Did I not star it or something? I read something and then I flipped to go look at 142 or 146 because you mentioned it, and now I cannot find it.
What a mystery.
Yeah,
looks like you might have to read it for yourselves and tell us in the comments which one's your favorite.
There's lots here that is really good for something that is really good for, kind of an insight into Nietzsche's thoughts generally. But there's also plenty of little maxims here that I think are just good to live your life by.
Yeah, he's like, you can't choose just one. I got to read them all. That's why I couldn't find any.
Yeah, there's one where he talks about loving thy neighbor. He doesn't really love that idea of loving thy neighbor from Christianity because he basically says it's like a selfish act that we don't really view as selfish because we're loving our neighbor kind of out of this part in particular. I maybe I should have read before I started talking about it because now I'm talking about it and struggling to remember. It's like a selfish act loving our neighbor. I believe he goes on a tirade about that in
the later passage. I remember that.
Yeah. Well, he goes on a tirade, I believe, about it in the Genealogy of Morals, if I'm not mistaken. He he does not like the idea of loving thy neighbor. Anywho, I wanted to end off kind of with the end of the book. Probably his most prescriptive section of the book where he's saying like what would be better, or I guess what was better about society before kind of traditional morality came in, before Christian morals came in. Essentially, right, he talks about master and slave morality and how the birth of human society is based on kind of pathology in some cases. It's closer to the men who were strong and willing to take charge were the ones who took charge, and they laid out what was good. He kind of tries to lay out how he thinks kind of human society came to be off the back of this. Something that he lays out, I want to say it's in this book, it might be in the Genealogy of Morals. Something he lays out in particular that I found really interesting was the idea that the noble or the strong, the old strong who were in charge and laid out what was good, they don't... when they have like an enemy, someone who disagrees with them, it's more of a respectable disagreement in general. When you have someone who is a noble and using their own definition of good. they might think that this opposition is bad, but they don't call it evil necessarily. Whereas you get to kind of the slave morality, or the herd morality, or any of the different types of that he lays out, like Christian morality, and for them, the opposition to the things that they call good are evil. They point to the Christians who think the meek and the weak are the good. Those people are good. They almost look to the opposite as evil, which I think was interesting to lay out as kind of like what I don't think it's true historically, but I don't think that's important. I think what's important there is to point to kind of the idea of Nietzsche's perspectivism, and what that could mean for a society that understands it and uses it, right? Where you're able to look at someone who disagrees with you as bad, but not evil in particular. I hope we can get to that point. I do think the whole in Nietzsche is that there are people who are particularly evil. That I think that you can't quite entirely get away from an idea or an ideal of kind of an objective morality, or even like a utilitarianism in some sense, because there are people who just like objectively want to hurt people or want to do things that a direct effect of them is that people will be hurt. And those people are bad at best, certainly, but evil at worst. And so I think, I don't know, again, I think this is kind of where the most obvious break from Nietzsche should be, even if you kind of buy into a lot of the other tenets of his philosophy. I don't know. I just think that there are some things that it would be hard for me to be like, okay, that is, even though I disagree with it, that's just opposition. Like, you just believe that. I don't know. That like there's some things that I think we should all think are bad morally.
Yeah.
You could argue maybe that maybe there would be a larger range of disagreement possible when you're talking about moral goods. Mm-hmm. But in particular, when he's talking about like disagreements between people, I find it difficult to pair that with the knowledge that there are like truly like pathologically evil people historically that we know were pathologically evil. I don't know. I think it's also important to say again, reiterate that kind of his main problem with these moralities was that he felt that they were created via resentment of the strong, resentment of things that they had or things that they did or what have you, some kind of resentment for their being strong, right? Versus like he just has a problem with herd mentality in general, or the herd, or the common man, or something like that. He has a particular problem with it. I recommend, if you want to read more about that, to read The Genealogy of Morals. I think it's clearer than Beyond Good and Evil. He actually wrote it to explain some of the ideas in Beyond Good and Evil. So yeah, the first two essays in that are really, really good, in my opinion. But I digress. Is there anything you wanted to add, Justin?
So that was a lot. I'm stumbling over where words right now. Overall, I appreciated my time with Nietzsche. I don't think I do like the idea of eternal recurrence. That's an interesting concept. I'm not entirely discounting. I mean, if I had to read another philosopher, it would probably be Nietzsche. But I don't know. I think philosophy is going to be more your game than mine. Just putting that out there. But I don't know. Beyond Good and Evil was it was very interesting, and I really liked the discussion we had. I don't know if I love the process of reading and outlining it very thoroughly, but it did lead to a very interesting reading of this book. But I don't know.
Reading philosophy gets a little easier with practice, but then like you hit a particularly hard philosopher or one you just don't quite get, and then you're back to square one. So, but Nietzsche in particular, I think, is
building blocks, right?
Yeah, Nietzsche in particular, I think, is not like superbly difficult, which is good.
That fills me with confidence.
Well, it's just you have to have practice. That's the thing. Practice. Philosophy is difficult to read in general, but I just mean like if you put philosophy on a scale of like least difficult to most difficult to read, Nietzsche would not be super high on that scale. He'd be on the lower end of it for sure. Not at the bottom for sure, but and certain books would be higher than others. Whatever. The point is I'm trying to say that mostly for people who have not tried and would like to. But yeah, I think there's a lot to take from Nietzsche. I think there are things that he talks about that I will bring like into my life going forward that I already have. The way that I kind of think about life and art and creating and work and purpose and suffering. I mean, some of it is stuff that I already kind of believed, but didn't know how to put into words. Some of it is actually stuff that I've read in the past that I really enjoy, that I was influenced by him and I didn't know. Like, Man's Search for Meaning. He who if you have a why, you can withstand any how. That's actually from Nietzsche. Originally. Oh. Yeah, that's not a Frankel original. It's he took it from Nietzsche. Yeah, it's from Twilight of the Idols, I believe. Either that or no, I don't remember. It's from one of his books. But anyways, the point is, I think there's lots to take from Nietzsche, and I think his society-wide arguments, I think the interesting part is he's very intelligent, and he sees a lot of things kind of before most people start to. He's very ahead of his time in that way. But I think part of the problem is that he's a little bit ahead of his time, and he comes to conclusions I don't completely agree with all the time, especially in terms of kind of the conclusions about, okay, if traditional morality is not where we're going, then what is noble? What about the strong from this book? I didn't super agree with a lot of those conclusions, but even in that chapter, there was lots of truth and stuff that I could agree with. There's a give and a take from Nietzsche. He's a very interesting, again, confounding figure, but there's a lot to love from him. There's a lot to take into your own life. He's a very individually positive figure in terms of like you as an individual human being, right? Reaching out for the greatest human that you can be, becoming better than yourself, and trying to live your life to the fullest, such that if you had to live it all over again, you would be, generally happy. But there's also a lot of stuff that was probably misinterpreted from him. There's probably a lot of stuff that I misinterpreted, that maybe I misinterpreted as better than I think it actually, or I would have thought if I had interpreted it correctly, or worse than I would have thought if I had interpreted it correctly. It's it's philosophy. You don't get all of it the first time. Yeah, I'm gonna read all of the stuff that I read again eventually, but I'll come back to it. But he is a figure who, again, there's so much truth and so much good in these books in terms of like good as in approaching true or approaching true belief, or however you want to phrase that. But there's also a lot to kind of sidle away from, and things that I would disagree with, things that I'm unsure about. So I heavily recommend reading Nietzsche at some point. Again, I would probably recommend starting with The Joyous Science or The Gay Science, whichever translation is fine. Gay isn't happy or joyous. But yeah, he is probably like, I can't say for every philosopher that I will take parts of his ideas into like my life and my philosophy and the way that I think about things. I can't say that for every philosopher. And so the fact that I can say that for Nietzsche, even though he's like got these things that I so heavily disagree with on, the fringes, it's high praise, I think. So yeah, heavily recommend.
And I think on that note, are we ending off?
Yeah, I think so. You can find us. If you enjoyed the episode, please give us a like, a rating, subscribe, follow, whatever it is on whatever platform. Hopefully on YouTube, we'll actually be making extra content.
You've been saying that for a year now?
Yeah. But Justin and I have been very busy, so we're going to do it eventually. We promise. Eventually. You can find us on Twitter and TikTok at Not Just Any Pod, where we've been not posting as much as we probably should be. But you can still find we're still there. We're still there, though. We're still the accounts are up. So
it's about the vibes.
That. Yeah. And yeah. Hope you enjoyed.
Next week.
Join us next month. Yeah, technically in a few weeks, really, for Augustus by John Williams. We're gonna read another John Williams book. I'm a little bit into it. It seems pretty good.
Yeah, I am anticipating reading this, so come on, check that out. And your name is Prometheus.